having now been in this space for a few years, I would say that probably coming in, my understanding of what it would be like was a bit more intellectual, in that I understood conceptually, what the work might be like, what the clientele might be like, but in terms of how that would feel for me as a worker and what it would be like day to day, particularly being based in an institutional environment, how challenging that could be in lots of different ways. So when I say conceptually, versus the lived experience, what I really mean is that I, hadn't experienced yet the kinds of ethical dilemmas that I might face as a practitioner, the level of, behaviours of concern that I might be working with, or the complexity of the client's presentations from a clinical point of view. It's very different, I think, to base an opinion or to understand a case based on written information versus what it's actually like witnessing their behaviour and actually working with them therapeutically.
I can remember looking back and feeling uncomfortable with it at the time, and thinking about it now, how I would approach it differently. My frustration at being seen as a young woman, and therefore my value to the organisation being minimalised and even sometimes sexualised. So people perceiving that the only reason why the male clients I would be working with, for example, would be, out of some form of titillation, if you will, as opposed to getting therapeutic benefit out of the work that we were doing. And so I can remember that being implied and sometimes directly stated, and feeling pretty resentful of that, and not believing that to be true, not experiencing that as being true from the client work.
What I wasn't expecting, I guess, was the different workplace politics and often workplace personalities that I would have to navigate as part of my job. And I remember that the very first day in the government department that I was hired to work for, I was completely unprepared for certain comments that were directed my way, because I was a young Asian female psychologist. And I remember the very first day on the job, I was as part of my orientation, I was brought around to different departments and places, and I was, within the first 5 minutes, I was mistaken as a Vietnamese interpreter. I'm of Chinese background. And then a couple of days later, I was asked to go out for dinner by a white male colleague. And when I turned him down, he made a comment along the lines of, I thought Asian females only came to Australia because they wanted to marry white men. So I was completely unprepared for these sorts of comments, certainly at the beginning of my career. And I had to learn very quickly that it's very important to set very firm boundaries right from the very beginning. And that comes through your manner of speech, the way your demeanour, the way you carry yourself in the workplace, down to how you might dress in the workplace, how you address people, how you speak to people. So it's very important to set those boundaries, as well as your expectations of people, the colleagues you work with, the clients that you work with, right from day one, because reputation is very important. People's first impressions are incredibly important. First impressions count for a lot, and often it will dictate people's subsequent communications with you.
I do think that there was a complete lack of understanding or heads up kind of thing around the nature of the work that I was going to be exposed to and how to manage that. So initially I did lots of reports on stranger perpetrated sexual assault and homicide, and back then there was a much higher prevalence of both homicide and stranger perpetrated homicide, but also stranger perpetrated sexual assault as well than there is now. So generally, I was early 20s and I live by myself. And so it definitely changed the way that I behaved at home in terms of home security. I would lock my windows, I would lock my doors, I would make sure that they were all locked. I was fairly paranoid about that kind of thing. If I was walking back to my car at night, I would have my keys in my hand and be really conscious of what's around me. And so I definitely created some sort of unhealthy, but I guess understandable self-care strategies at that stage.
Have there been times on reflection that you've experienced vicarious trauma or hypervigilance and security concerns? Absolutely. The hypervigilance, I think, just becomes part of life, really. The way you walk, the way you sit or you stand, entering a restaurant, you always know where the exits are. You watch people and you often can pick up very easily different people's energies. You become very protective. I definitely became very protective over the safety of my own children when I had children. So, I'd be checking on them when they're sleeping, checking doors, windows of houses, are they locked? And I think there's an element of that being really normal and natural as well, that security system, but I think it is heightened working in the criminal justice setting. For me, it was around being really aware that those behaviours existed and understanding that they were there for my own safety. But if it got too much or I started to experience anxiety because of it, then to reach out to, my own trusted professional.
I have to admit that as an allied health practitioner and as a psychologist, there's a particular, a particular way that we, can experience vicarious trauma. And part of that is because the nature of our job requires us to talk to young people or to talk to clients about traumatic experiences and really difficult things that they've been through. So in terms of how that's affected me, I would say I have noticed at times when I've been basically feeling overloaded with lots of details about a young person's traumatic experience or a client's historical experiences of neglect, abuse, different kinds of trauma memories that we might have been trying to work to process. All of those things at different times I've noticed have basically stuck in my own brain a little bit. And that's how I've talked about it in supervision or talked about it through accessing formal support like EAP is I've had trouble, maybe switching off from that particular story, or I have found myself imagining what that might have been like for a particular client, which was really challenging.